Hi, Ron Fairfield, 58 years behind the chair. Welcome to my channel. And if you were with me at the last video, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it or you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe and share. Just click the link below and that would be great. The last video I shared the beginning of my career, the opening sort of stages of how I came into hairdressing. And I talked very briefly about my three main mentors, the ones that made the biggest impact on me. Although there were many people along the way, those were the three that made the biggest impact. So I'd like to start off really by going from that point and talking a bit more about my training and my apprenticeship, because it's very different now to how it was back then in 1968. So I applied for and got offered a job, as I said before, Mrs. Edith Roberts in Broadway in Peterborough. And in those days it was a 5-year apprenticeship. And those 5 years were spent 3 years training and then 2 years what they called improvership. And the theory was that you trained for 3 years and you went to college 1 day a week, day release for 2 years. The rest of the time I did all my training in salon with Charles, and before him his mum, Mrs. Roberts, and I then went on to do what we called 2-year improvership. And that theory was that you did your training and then you put it into practice. You actually had a go at starting to build clientele, starting to get known as a young stylist. It's kind of like the green beginner plates driving that we do now. That's very different now to how it is now. And in those days it was City and Guilds. So I did City and Guilds Basic, and that was the 2 years that I did at college, just day release. And then after that, once you'd had some years of experience, if you wanted to, you'd go back and do advanced City and Guilds. And it was very advanced. For instance, my basic City and Guilds training course included wig making, something that's not done anymore. Although it's ironic that one of the biggest things in hairdressing now, I think one of the biggest changes has been hair extensions. Of course, when we did wig making, we learned how to make the wefts that make up hair extensions, the clip-in hair extensions. So even though it seemed out of time, it's very relevant again. We did science in the science department at college, not taught by the hairdressing lecturers, but taught by the science lecturers at college. We did art and design, taught in the art department at college, not taught by the hairdressing lecturers, but taught by the art lecturers in the college. So each area of the training was very specifically specialised, and for that reason it was very thorough, and I really enjoyed it. I loved being learning and finding out new stuff. And so then after I'd finished my training, in those days you kind of did your 5 years and you were kind of expected to go and get yourself a job in another salon. It was about being recognised as a stylist, and if you stayed in the same salon, there was always that issue that you were still the junior, you were the youngster, you were the student, and you had to sort of make yourself, create a profile for yourself and be seen as a stylist. And at that time, I guess the main way to do that was to leave and get a stylist job. And I went from working with Charles to working with a guy called Jeffrey Flanders in a salon called Jeffrey Johns in Peterborough. Now, Jeff had trained at London College of Fashion, and he still worked in Chelsea. He worked in the Peterborough salon part of the week, and the rest of the week he worked in Chelsea. He had clients like Elizabeth Taylor and Marjorie Proops, the journalist, and people, well-known people back then in the late 60s, early 70s. And so, again, I was working with an incredible mentor. It was all very glamorous, really, I have to say, in comparison to nowadays. The sound system in the salon was vinyl. Can you imagine? You had to put a vinyl record on. But it was things like David Bowie and Elton John and all sorts of, kind of really trending music at that time in the late 60s, early 70s. And it was played quite loudly, and it was part of the whole vibe. It was a party vibe in the salon. It was amazing. And we had a good time. We really did. But alongside that, there was an arrogance about it, We'd gone from an era in the 50s, 40s, 50s, where the client was always right. The hairdresser did what the client asked them to do. No question about that. And there was no real strong input from the hairdresser, generally, I'm generalizing. But then we hit the 70s, and all of a sudden hairdressers were like, no, we're artists, we're creative, and our input's really important. So we will tell the clients what's right for them. So it became a very arrogant sort of, we're the artists, we're the creatives, we're going to tell you what. And I can remember saying to people, look, this is what you should have. And if you don't want that, well, maybe you should try another hairdresser. I mean, it's terrible, and I cringe at the thought of it now. But back then, it was how we all were. And, I'll talk more about where we've got to now and how that's changed. But at the time, it was very much about, we know what's best. And for the most part, clients have followed us and gone along the way and have accepted that, generally, they want to listen to what we've got to say as hairdressers, the specialists, if you like. Even down to the fact that sassoons, for instance, in those days, the artistic director in each of the sassoon salons had the chair nearest the door. And their job was to make sure that every client that left sassoons in those days had a sassoon haircut. And if you left with a haircut that wasn't a signature sassoon haircut, you were sent back. Your stylist was told, no, I'm sorry, this client can't leave, she hasn't got a sassoon haircut, because they wanted everybody to know that you'd been to sassoons. It was a branding thing, which had never been seen before. You didn't have a sense of, oh, I can tell where that person's been. But now, in those days, that was very much the case with a lot of the branded salons, and certainly Sassoons, who was leading the way in creative hairdressing. But so what was happening back in the suburbs, and I count Peterborough as one of the suburbs, well, we were still doing a mix. We were doing a mix of traditional hairdressing, still using rollers, but also doing all of the new cuts and blow dries in the salon. So, people were coming because they wanted the new looks, and we didn't exclude the ladies that wanted traditional looks. So it was a good time. It was a good time of transition between those two things. Now, the biggest thing that happened during that period, for all you young stylists out there, is that up until that moment, clients would come to the salon every week, and they'd have a roller set. And then people wanted to have blow drying instead of roller sets. So we started to do blow dries. Now, the issue there was salons would do, the stylists I worked for would do 4 or 5 clients an hour because they had roller sets, which took them 4 or 5 minutes to put in. Client was quite relaxed. I would then take them over to the hood dryer, give them a cup of tea or coffee, magazines, and they'd sit and they'd have a cigarette. Can you believe it? People used to smoke in the salon. And then to come out after half an hour, hair dried, I would take the rollers out. The stylist would style the hair. Well, again, it would take 5 or 6 minutes at most. So a stylist could see 4 clients an hour. But then people wanted to go with blow dries because they were getting started to have maybe a new cut. And all of a sudden, stylists could only do 2 clients an hour. That's half an hour for a blow dry. But of course, economically, they were too scared to charge twice as much for a blow dry as they had for a set. And so overnight, the economics of hairdressing was halved. And suddenly, salons that were making good money were suddenly not seeing the return that they had before. And they didn't really, I think, overall understand that. So stylists now, you're looking on at our prices and you're thinking, well, prices are quite expensive now for clients. Well, actually, in real terms, prices are very much lower in value than they were then. And I remember at the time, one of my clients saying to me that as a young woman, it used to cost her a week's wages to get her hair permed and cut. So you extrapolate that forward, then the prices today are very much undervalued based on that. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that as we go along on our journey. So I hope that gives you some insight into apprenticeships and training as opposed to nowadays. We'll pick that up in the next video, and I hope you found it interesting. I'll do my very best to keep you interested, and if you enjoyed it and you'd like to hear more, please subscribe and like, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you very much. Bye.